let's get to the reason we're here, which is to talk about families, secrets, grandfathers, grief, violence, and boys named Joe. So welcome to this session at Words on the Waves here on Darkinjung country, the land of the original storytellers of this place. As you heard, my name's Kate, and I do all my reading on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, not too far from here. So with us today are two writers whose work intersects in really rich ways. Tony Birch is a poet, novelist, storyteller and academic. He's the Boisbouvier, I'm never quite sure how to say that, Boisbouvier Chair in Australian Literature at Melbourne University, and his books include Shadowboxing, The White Girl and Common People, but we're going to concentrate today on his latest, Women and Children. So good to see you again, Tony. And Myfanwy Jones is a writer and essayist whose books include the charmingly named Parlour Games for Modern Families, although I've made a typo here and I've written Parlous Games for Modern Families, and the novels The Rainy Season and Leap. But today we'll be concentrating on her third novel, Cool Water. So hi, Myf. And so here's the startling thing. Both of your novels include a boy of about 11 years old. So on that cusp between childhood and adolescence, both boys are called Joe. So let's bring those boys on the stage with us to kick things off. Tony, how would you describe your Joe? He's in Melbourne's Fitzroy in the 1960s.
Yeah, my Joe is, he's very much an idealist as a boy. He sort of lives in his imagination more than reality. He has quite a difficult time at school. He goes to Catholic school and is taught by the nuns, and he's a boy who gets in trouble quite a lot at school, not for anything really too dramatic, but gets in trouble nonetheless and is severely punished. So for him at school, the two issues around violence are violence of language. So he goes to a school where the notion of hell is a literal interpretation, and hell is a place to be greatly feared, and that is the only reason that he believes in God, because he's too scared not to, which is a very personal history of mine. He has a very loving home life. So he lives with his mother, Marion, and his sister, Ruby. So he has a very loving home life. And around the corner where his grandfather lives, he spends a lot of time, and certainly in the novel, he spends a lot of time with his grandfather, who's a retired street sweeper and a collector of stuff that he's picked up on the streets over the years. So essentially, that's who he is, and his life in some ways is fractured when his auntie, Una, so Marion's younger sister, Una, suffers violence at the hand of a male perpetrator, her partner, a terrible man called Ray Lomax.
And we're going to meet those characters as this discussion goes on. And I love the description of Joe in your book. I think it said he carried trouble in his back pocket, and that was somewhere close to the nuns being described as mad as cut snakes from memory. Now, Myf, a long way from Melbourne, your child Joe is in the Atherton Tablelands in Queensland in the 1950s. What type of kid is he?
I found it fascinating that we both had 11-year-old Joes for a start who are kind of bearing witness to adult business, and I think are both very tender. I think my Joe doesn't have the fight that your Joe has, and partly because he's not in a safe family home. He's in an environment where his family's being terrorised by his father. So I loved reading about your Joe and the ways in which he stood up for himself and his family.
And I guess one of the differences with the two Joes that we meet, Myf, is that we see two sides of Joe. So we meet him as an 11-year-old boy, but we also see the man he becomes, and we see him through the eyes of his own son, who he's sort of terrorised in a way. So there's this terrible sense of this tender boy who's brutalised.
Yeah, he's such a lovely, sensitive soul, but he's so systematically crushed by his father that he, like his father does, needs to cut off his own vulnerability. And when he becomes a father himself, and I guess my novel, which is multi-generational, is largely about how men make men and how fathers make sons and then sons turn into fathers, and sort of about the intractability of some of these patterns, but also how slow change happens and the hard, sort of silent, invisible work of that change. And I think my Joe as an adult is a very different father from his own father, but he's also he's also like his father in ways, and he also does intimidate his family.
I was just saying one of the common interests there is that, in a sense, what Myfanwy has just said is that my real life situation is so opposite to the fiction I created, so that this is a novel where the home is a safe haven for Joe, and as is his grandfather's house. My house would reflect more the childhood home of your Joe, where my father terrorised us for many, many years. It's interesting that when I wrote this, I wanted to create a male figure, or two male figures, in fact, Ranji, Charlie's best mate, two older male figures who would be the opposite of that terrorising male, to show, well, men can be good role models for children and younger men. Men can be loving and soft, because that's my experience as a grandfather. My wife said to me, it's the first novel I've written where I play two characters, the grandson and the grandfather. So I see myself in the 11-year-old Joe, but as a grandfather of 4 grandchildren, I see myself in the character of Charlie. So it's a way of trying to give something to readers and to myself in a way to say, but okay, we can sometimes, see ourselves reflected in our father's image, but we can subvert that and break that intergenerational trauma.
And you do have that generational thing too, because there's a line in the first half of your novel where Charlie's reflecting that when he was hiding under a bed and hearing his father beat his mother, that he realised now that was him trying to teach him how to be a man, which I think is, yeah.
So that sense of boys who, entire families who are walking on eggshells because they don't know which version of the father is going to walk into the room. You make that really explicit in Cool Water, but I guess it's what you lived with, Tony.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone remembers the late British novelist Beryl Bainbridge. She wrote a wonderful essay once about her father, who was insane, and she said that in her family home at the tea table in England, that her father might rage against a politician, or he might rage against a lump in a potato. And it was the saying. So that unpredictability I recognised personally. So with my dad, he would start to look at you in a certain way, and you knew it was coming, but you never knew why it was coming. And although it might be the result of alcohol, most likely it wasn't. So there's a misconception there about men and alcohol. And you would think, am I sitting at the table wrong? Do I have my leg crossed over the other leg? Have I eaten with my mouth open? Have I said something out of order to my sister? And it could be any one of those things or none of those things. So the unpredictability of that was terrible. And of course that creates an enormous friction in the household. And I think in real life, it might seem like a macabre thing to say, I was relieved when he finally assaulted us, because you would then get a sort of peak, and then he would stop for a while. So the build-up was worse. In the novel, of course, again, it's the opposite, that the family home is a place of sanctuary. And ultimately in the novel, it's when that sanctuary is fractured by an outsider that people decide or need to act in a very particular way to protect, not only to protect the family, but to protect, it's a classic kitchen sink drama. I don't know, I make so many cups of tea in this novel. People drinking tea all the time that I I should have got sponsored by Lipton's or something. That you're not gonna. This is not gonna penetrate this house. We're going to protect this house and protect the children and women in it.
Miss, can I ask you what or where is sanctuary for Joe? Because it's not necessarily in the making. Well, it's not the making cups of tea in his own house, is it?
No, and when that was one of the things I loved reading your novel. There's so much comfort, and not just tea. There's sausage rolls and cheese sandwiches, and Joe in his own home. It's just hypervigilance and it's sort of constant terror. And as you were saying, like, you can try to avoid all the hotspots, but you actually can't because you don't know where it's coming from or what the next problem will be. But my Joe finds sanctuary. He's a paper boy in the little town of Tinaroo beside the dam in the 1950s when the dam is being built. And on his round, he strikes up a friendship with a very lonely woman called Evelyn, who is unable to have a child. And they develop a really close friendship. And every Friday afternoon, he turns up at Evelyn's door and she makes tea.
And scones.
And scones. And in terms of this sort of idea of silences and speaking, which I know run through both of our novels, Evelyn and Joe have these wonderful conversations, but there's also lots that isn't said and can't be said on both sides.
I'm always really interested in the shape of silences in novels because there's so many different types of secrets. And one of the first ones that we hear about in Women and Children, Tony, is Joe realising or being told about what you do and don't say about the bruises you see on other children's bodies at the swimming pool.
Yeah, I use the term swimming pool quite loosely. People often talk about that swimming pool, and if anyone's ever been to Melbourne, in the Carlton Gardens, there's a playground which was before that one of those kids' traffic schools. Talking about occupational health and safety, when I was a kid, and this is played out in the novel, there was a concrete sort of shallow pond, almost half the size of a football oval, really big. And then for it was going to be hot on the weekend, the council workers would come and the hydrants around the pool, they would fill it with water. And then after about a week of swimming, it would be sort of like a dark green colour, And then they would empty it, scrub the floor, and that's the pool where this action takes place. And what happens, of course, is that Joe, he sees the bruises of other kids who have experienced violence at home, and he talks to his sister about it. And what he's told and what he learns is that you never ask anyone what the bruises are for, although, of course, you know. And I think there's a thread of this that has run through my work all the way back to shadowboxing with a story in that novel, that story collection called The Butcher's Wife, where everyone knows what's actually happened, whether it be seeing the bruise on a woman's face or on a child's body, but no one asks. And the reason you don't ask is once you ask, or once someone names what the secret is, you're complicit. So the idea is as long as you don't ask, you outwardly at least are not complicit. So the secrets, it's a bit like the tension around the home. The secrecy around that level of violence, whether it be at school with the church or at home, it creates its own terrible vibration because you don't know what you're not sure what you're not supposed to talk about. So when you're growing up in these houses and you're sitting around the tea table, there are so many topics that can't be spoken of. And even if you were to hear an assault in the thinly paved wall next door, you pretend you can't hear that. So if someone said, "Oh, what's happening? Can you hear that?" Other people would say, "Oh, I can't hear it." So it's about not being open about that level of secrecy.
And the terrible weight that then puts on a child to hold that secret. But I wonder if those silences and secrets are the same or different in your novel, Myf, because part of it is, and I think you either use the word horrible or terrible in the first page of your novel, and it's the sort of horribly handsome man that is Joe's father, because he is ostensibly charming and he's the butcher who flirts with all of the women. But does the town know that he is a monster?
No, I don't think they do. I mean, I think a few of them, no, he's off. And I was thinking, in ahead of this panel about silence and speaking and how they don't really have fixed values in my novel. I think that they could be good or bad, because in a way my Victor has a silver tongue, and at home though he charms the whole township, and it's women and it's men, but at home he's controlling and terrorising, and his terrorising silences Joe, and Joe carries that silence forth into his adult life, and as a father he continues to be silent. And it's partly because he's been so crushed, but it's also because he doesn't trust speaking because of the way that his father used speaking as a weapon, I guess. But then his silence has quite a negative impact on his son. So it sort of moves around, and because his son finds him quite withholding and contemptuous, and also he doesn't understand him. He doesn't understand where he's come from and what he's inherited.
And so I guess that makes it very important, Tony, to have these other male figures who are tender and charming and kind. And you've already mentioned Charlie, who's the grandfather. But tell us more about him.
Yeah, well, Charlie is Joe's grandfather, Marion's dad. He's just retired as a street sweeper on the local council. I think it's an interesting aside here that a couple of reviewers, and this book has had very good reviews, still make the mistake of talking about poverty. And there's no poverty in the book. I mean, sausage rolls and bacon sandwich. I was laughing before because when I did my novel, I know this is not the question, when I did my novel The White Girl, Sissy and her grandmother, I did enjoy a lunch of fried bread and a cup of tea. When I was a kid, when we had no money, my mother conned us that when we had to have only black tea and fried bread on lard, on fat, that's all we had left in the house. She would say that's what Superman eats to stave off kryptonite. And my older brother said, fuck Superman, So I wanted to bring that back as something to be enjoyed in The White Girl. It's interesting, in The White Girl, they eat pieces of that fried bread almost like it's a communion host that melts in their mouth.
Oh, so that's the Catholic reference.
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
Can't resist it.
So
It's also delicious. My grandmother used to do dripping on.
Yeah. So Charlie is a retired street sweeper, and we need to understand that makes him royalty. I mean, this is in the 1960s, he has a council job. It's a unionised job. He has sick leave, he has annual leave, he has superannuation, which in the 60s a lot of people don't have. So to have a local council job, so when my old man worked at the Fitzroy Council, people go, oh, that's amazing, because other men and women were working in factories inside, and he was planting trees at the Edinburgh Gardens and working outdoors. So it was a really highly valued job. Of course,
it was also a community job, wasn't it? Everybody knew Charlie.
Yeah, everyone knows Charlie because he's getting around the streets. He does little tasks in the street of helping people. Of course, he's always talking to people. So the guys who swept the streets in our street, and they still used a horse and cart in the 60s on our street. Yeah, my mum would talk to these fellas out the front. You'd be coming home from school, and they'd give you, on the back of the cart, there'd be a little thing of tennis balls, of books, of toys, and the guy say, you want a new tennis ball? And you'd be walking home from school, you go home with a tennis ball, right? So Charlie is that valued and loved, and he deeply loves his grandson. And what I loved in creating Charlie, and I think this is the reflection of myself, is that he's also very childish in the most brilliant way. So him and 11-year-old boy are able to meet on an equal level of playfulness. So he's a very playful character, and that was quite deliberate. Now, unfortunately, I've never known a man like that in my own life as a child, but thinking about my relationship with my kids, but more with my grandkids, that I look after one of my grandkids each Tuesday all day, and I did it with my oldest granddaughter, Isabel, who's now 8. I then did it with her little brother, Archie, who's just started primary. I now have his cousin, Charlie, and then after next year I'll have his little brother, Louis. So it'll be like an 8-year sentence. And I look forward to that day of the week as much as any other day. And the playfulness of that allows you to be playful is something that was really part of his character. But also, I think for him, he's still a flawed character, and he's asking questions about his own past behaviours, about his terrible childhood, and also his relationship to spirituality or to religion, which remains unresolved for him, which is something I wanted to reflect in each of the characters. They're all hedging their bets about God, or of different forms of God. None of them have checked out, but none of them are totally checked in.
And I do want to get back to his bookshelves as well. We might do that a bit later. And I love it when fiction deals with work and with both, what it means that Charlie had this job, what it meant to him and what he did. But in contrast to Charlie's work as a street sweeper, Joe's dad is the butcher, and he's a butcher with an underlying smell of rot. And Joe has to help, or, there's that sense of cutting off the meat that's gone a bit on the turn. And so why did you choose butchery? And I guess there's a fishmonger in there too. Why did you choose meat, all that flesh, for the work at the heart of this book?
This is a bit of a cop-out, but I can't remember really choosing it. I wanted there to be a family business, and I wanted it to be in that place. And butchery is bloody, and it's a bloody story, and family is bloody. And it's hands-on. And I guess it also speaks to other themes in the novel, which are about how the land is being used and exploited, and how that sort of is changing through the generations too. So in the front story, Frank, his daughter who's getting married, is a vegan, and Frank's moved into sustainable mud crabs. So that's sort of, the family business is tracking something broader as well there.
Well, and the other thing that you've sort of hinted at, but that we haven't spelt out for people who haven't read your book, is that where the story is set in Tinaroo, there is a huge dam project. It's one of those enormous public works projects that eventually floods the town. Now, I think when we in New South Wales think about flooded towns, we think about Adaminaby and the Snowy scheme. But the Tinaroo Dam, so that's a real project, isn't it? So tell us more about how much that place shapes the story.
Yeah, I think the story came from the place, which tends to be what happens for me with ideas. So it was a happy accident that I went there in 2018 on a family holiday. Where we usually were going to stay was booked out. It was peak season, and there was plenty of room at Tinaroo Dam. And at that time there was a drought, and the dam was at about 25% capacity, and it was full of blue-green algae, and quite an eerie place. There was not many people staying there, and I was just struck by the layers of history there. And around the foreshore there were signs that told the story of the dam's construction, and a lot of the migrant workforce came from Snowy scheme. It was built for the tobacco industry in the mid-1950s, and I think it was the biggest agricultural dam built in Queensland for a single industry. And the tobacco industry later failed. And the man, there's a hydrographer who worked on the dam project who in recent times has said he regrets how it all played out, that they were thinking in terms of quantity, not quality, and how it was going to affect the river system. And also, the dam ends up submerging this town of Killara. And when I was there, bits of the old town of Killara had begun to emerge. And it just seemed like there was a big story to be told.
So there's a big real story, but it's also a gift for me in terms of the symbolic use of it. So you're buried Fitzroy, the place that used to be there and the place that you still know. Why do you keep returning to that landscape in your fiction?
I think, as an out, I would like to say that two of my novels are not set there. Obviously, The White Girl is set in a regional town, and I'm not. The question's absolutely spot on. Ghost River is actually set at, and I mean, it's weird if you don't come from that area. You think, well, where Ghost River says about a mile in the old measurements, so that's sort of the same place. But anyone who grew up in Fitzroy knew that it wasn't Collingwood and vice versa. So Ghost River is set on the Yarra River around Collingwood. I think there are two reasons. I think that part of it is place-based, so part of it is not only to recall stories of places that you know, so I live in the suburb, but places that are gone. So the part of Fitzroy that I grew up on was obliterated for the slum clearance of the 1960s. And when I say part of it, I mean, I'm talking about, the pub my dad drank in, the milk bar you went to, my grandmother's house, my great-grandmother's house. So we had about 7 households of extended family in 2 streets. So you are really talking about your whole childhood existence no longer physically existing. So I think part of it is a recovery project. It's interesting that on Adnimmerby, Peter Reid wrote a great book about lost towns, and that town and many others have sort of slightly re-emerged over the years. And I was always fascinated by that, because with Adnimmerby, people went back there after decades and were able to point to the traces of their house to their grandkids. Oh, that's where I live. Well, for me, you can't do that. So that I've walked past places, I can walk past my old primary school, I can walk past other places, but I can't go to that place. So part of it is to recover those landscapes. But I think more so, all of my novels have children, if not the central protagonist, very close to it. And I am repeatedly fascinated by childhood, and I think you used the term witness. I'm fascinated by that notion that children are sometimes the most important witnesses to adult life, because I don't think that they, even though, in Joe's case, he is sworn to this secrecy, there's a truth that him and Ruby know that has to be told. And I think in this novel, there is talk about what he will be. He will be the storyteller. So that I think that I feel as an adult, so I didn't come to writing until very late. I didn't publish Shadowbox until I was 49. I hadn't written anything until my 40s. And I was a voracious reader, but I never thought that I would be a writer. And I think that I do feel the part of my sense of self is that the stories I want to tell are twofold, and that is to recover memories, but also that I like to write about people on the margins of society rather than the centre. I mean, I know this family is much more centred than my other work, and in The White Girl I know that Odette and Sissy are, but their stories are often marginalised. So obviously for women, talking about family violence, historically where I come from, and it's still a shocking issue today, women are silenced, their stories are silenced. And even now, I would argue, if you were at an otherwise enjoyable social day out and a woman started to talk about having been physically assaulted by a partner, they don't want that story to be told. So in this book in particular, even though it's a historical narrative, the place that it's set in and the experience is to say, I do see my writing as being concerned with trying to reveal stories that are otherwise not heard or not read.
How do you understand what it is that's at the heart of your writing, Myf? I mean, grief in the other
Grief
book
recurs.
of yours, grief
Yeah.
is a big thing.
That's a really big question.
It's too big.
Kate. Can I come back to that? But I was just thinking on childhood, I think, is it Ada who tells your Joe at one point, this is the smartest you're ever going to be when you're a child? You'll just get less smart.
Maybe I'll get you to think about how you describe writing about grief and whether you feel comfortable talking about that. And I'll go back to Tony on the question of who's witnessing what, because there's another character who you've mentioned but we haven't really talked about, and that's Ruby, who's Joe's sister. She is a smart kid. She's really smart. She's looking at the world, and there is an extraordinary scene in the novel when she is ministering to the body of her aunt. And there is such tenderness and sort of heartbreak in it as well. And it's about women, a young woman looking after an older woman. What did you want to show with that sort of ministering to the body?
Yeah, well, so Ruby, until that point, her life is completely strategic. So she's the best student in school. She gets the win the prize of going away on the holiday. She seems like the most devout. She gets 100 out of 100 for catechism, which I did.
Can you still quote them? I'm hoping.
No.
I don't know any of this.
So you get 100 questions, you have to give 100 answers, and I got them all right. I did win a statuette of Jesus Christ, which my older sister then desecrated by drawing a hoppy in the front street, and just sort of his head, when she brought him back inside, half his head was missing.
And that scene is in the book.
Yeah.
And I was rereading your novel this week. I read it when it first came out, and it did make me laugh.
Yeah, so Ruby is a little bit like my older sister. The fact is, Ruby doesn't believe in God at all. She knows, or what she knows enough is to be a good, studious girl at school will keep her out of trouble. She won't get the strap. She'll get to go away on the holidays. So she's hedging her bets the whole way. What changes for her is when she comes back from this holiday, she knows that there's something wrong in the family. She knows that there's a level of secrecy about recent events, but although she's not aware of what it is, she realises this must involve my auntie. And the scene that you're talking about is after she goes to Una's house and then returns to the family home with Una, is that literally she cleanses Una's body, washes her, and cleanses her of any traces of blood of the perpetrator. So in other words, she cleans under her auntie's fingernails where there are traces of blood, and she says to herself she doesn't want any of that evidence of violence on her auntie's body. The two things I wanted to show was, of course, the tenderness in love in that, which is obvious. There is a sort of a religious aspect to it. I was thinking of Mary Magdalene at the time. But also, through Ruby, there's a moment where Ruby has to look at her auntie naked, which she's never done before, and she's a little embarrassed about that, but then shakes that off and realises what she needs to do. I wanted to convey that there was nothing between her and her auntie, that all the secrecy would be stripped away by having to look at her auntie's naked flesh, but also her flesh that had been damaged. The other aspect of it is that I was determined in this novel that at no point in the novel would there be a scene that describes Ray Lomax's violence. So in other words, there is no scene where you witness Ray and Una together and him assaulting her. I didn't want to. That's all off camera. But the aftermath of what Ray's done, I wanted that to be not only on camera, but almost like a close-up lens, not to show the brutality, but again to show whatever had happened to Una's body, the love that Ruby conveys through the washing of her auntie was more powerful. And to be honest about not that, but I have to be really honest and say I remember for me, a most common childhood experience would be sitting at the kitchen table of a morning and my older sister would be washing my mother's head, where my mother would have a wound that normally you should have gone to hospital and had stitched, but she would never do that because that would mean telling the truth. And my older sister of washing my mother's hair and trying to close the wound up, to put band-aids on her head and so forth. And I don't think that level of intimacy between my sister and my mother is such that they have such an intense bond now, like 60 years later, that comes out of that. What's interesting about my sister as an adult is similar to Ruby. She's loving, but she's also quite tough in a way. My older sister, as much as that intimacy has always been part of life, her form of love is a sort of fairly tough form of love. You know that she will always take care of you, but there's a sort of a hardness to her which has come out of that lifetime of experience. So if I do a sequel, Ruby will some ways grow into being my older sister, I think.
Well, and Ruby could certainly sustain a novel. It just strikes me, though, that not that any of those characters should feel any shame, but in both of your novels, shame is something that they have to confront and deal with. And Myf, I think it's too hard to put you on the spot and say, talk about grief in your fiction.
No, I'm ready now.
Yeah, well,
I'll give it a stab.
do you want to talk about shame as well? Because that sort of comes up in your book.
I'll judge grief first.
Double whammy.
Yeah, grief, shame, joy. Take your pick.
I think I get a bit flummoxed because my previous novel, Leap, was very clearly about grief. And I thought, this isn't going to be about grief. But in fact, it is again. And if I think back, I think my first novel was also about grief. And I think the grief in all of them is quite ambiguous in different ways. And I think in my first novel, the grief is based on a missing parent. And in Leap, there is confusion around how a death has occurred. And I think in Cool Water, Frank is grieving his dad, but it's a very complicated grief because it's a real love-hate relationship. He's both sort of glad his dad's gone, but is still wanting his dad's approval after his dad's death. And I guess too that the flip side of grief is love, and I think all of my writing is also concerned with love and tenderness and the complexity of human attachment.
And shame?
Thank you, Tony.
Why don't you get us started with
I'll do shame. I think the strongest element of shame in this book is felt through Una, and it's something she shouldn't feel, but it's another shocking reality. Often women the women I know who experience violence, they would feel terrible shame and guilt, which is shocking when you think that your mother feels guilty because she's suffered an assault, and it might be guilty that you've had to witness it or you've heard it or you've got to look at her face afterwards. The shame is walking down the street with a black eye and other people in the street knowing what's happened again about that secrecy. And in Una's case, her shame is such that, and again, it might be hard for some people to understand. She goes back to Ray. She goes back to Ray knowing that there's more trouble. And she goes back to Ray because she feels shame of having brought that violence into her sister's home. Not brought it in as in Ray being there in that first instance, but the fact that she goes to her sister for help and Joe sees his auntie's body. We know what's happened, and she feels shameful about that, and she doesn't want... She has a fear that Ray will come to her sister's house, and she doesn't want that violence to penetrate the house, so she returns to him. And that is the shame that women, I think, historically and in a contemporary sense, felt and feel, that in some way they're not responsible for the violence, but they feel responsible for the impact on their family. And she lives with that shame quite acutely.
And that then connects back to one of the themes of the session, which is secrets. Because that sense of shame, however misguided, leads to things being hidden, doesn't it? And so your Joe, Myf, is walking around with this whole secret life and sense of his family. And one of the things I found interesting was that one of the places where he found tenderness was with this lonely but unconventional woman, Evelyn. So she's an artist. She wants other things in her life. And one of the ways that she shows her tenderness to him is she gives him a book. She says, read this. And it's Conrad's Call of the Wild. So why that book, and what did it mean to him?
Yeah, she gives him this dog-eared copy that was her favourite book when she was a child. And I don't know how conscious she is of this, but I think that she, although Joe doesn't talk to her about what's going on at home, she sees how vulnerable he is, and she wants him, as plays out in that story, to learn to trust his own instincts fundamentally. And he does, he takes that book to his heart. And I loved that in your novel too, Tony, how much storytelling plays this function of passing on family history and warnings and parables, and how sometimes when you are in a thing of having to be silent and shame about what's going on, how stories and books can communicate for you.
And I just love the use of the word parable, because when I put in the story about the talking dog, which sounds ludicrous, although you haven't met my own Jack Russell, Kess, is that you think, well, yeah, that is a bit ludicrous. And then I'm thinking, no, hang on, I went to a school where we went through the loaves of bread and the fish. So if we can put up with that, we can put up with a talking Jack Russell.
And I do want to get to the bookshelf that appears in your book, and it's a wonderful bookshelf. But just thinking about storytellers, you haven't told us a whole lot about Ranji, who runs a scrap metal yard, and I think he might emerge from a grandfather or great-grandfather of yours.
Yeah, so that's a long story, but the short version is, and people have started to exoticize my bio even to a length that I didn't realise. But so I always say, the Ranji character, and I've said this beforehand because I've written about him in non-fiction, is based on a man called Bhutta Khan, who I say was my great-grandfather by marriage. And what I mean by that is that he's not my biological great-grandfather, but he married my great-grandmother very early on in her life after she divorced a drunken Irish husband, which is unusual, isn't it? And I knew him as my great-grandfather. So within my community, both my working class community and my Aboriginal community, that the notion that he's not my great-grandfather because biologically he's not is irrational. So by all intents and purposes, he is my great-grandfather. But then when people start to say I'm of Afghan descent, they've crossed the line. But so Bhutta Khan was an amazing man. He came to Melbourne in the 1890s. There was no nation at the time. There was no Australia, of course, until 1901. He sold haberdashery from a cart that he wheeled around the streets. My great-grandmother had married and divorced her Irish husband and had my grandfather, her child. And then one day this man from the Punjab knocked on her door to sell her some cloth, and they fell in love. They went to the Punjab and lived for 10 years. So she left Fitzroy in 1920, went to India, married, converted to Islam, came back 10 years later with 5 other kids. And those great aunts and uncles of mine all lived in Fitzroy. And I still have cousins who live in Fitzroy today from that line. So I knew not only him, but 3 or 4 families of Punjabi Muslims who gathered at that house at least once a week for prayer. So I grew up seeing Islamic prayer as a normal thing. And he was a very, very quiet, devout, but loving man. Obviously didn't drink or smoke, didn't say much, but when he did, it mattered. So I always revered him as this figure in life. So when I wanted to write the Ranji character, and it's a bit of a amalgam, so Ranji is also the nickname of my great-great-uncle on the other side of my family, and I won't tell his history, that's even more complicated, but I wanted to write a character who, he's the same age as Charlie, he runs a scrapyard, so Charlie's done business with him, and they're a bit comic. That was deliberate to make them both gentlemen. And I also wanted to reveal, even though he seems like a more devout man religiously, so he prays 5 times a day, he's also got problems because he actually didn't feel an affirmation of his spirituality and all until after his father's death, and he feels shame of the way that he disregarded his father. And there's a lovely moment toward the end of the book when Charlie says, "Are you going to pray?" He says, "Today's not a good day to pray." And we know...
For reasons that you'll discover if you haven't read the book.
But so there's he's devout, but also there's a great exchange of humour in these men about the church. Like he tells a story about when he used to deliver to a convent, and he'd never seen more unhappy people than the most religious people in the Catholic Church.
Myf, we've been making these sort of overt, and not necessarily so overt, connections between Tony's life and his fiction. Do you draw a line between your own life and your fiction, or do you see it as a separate thing?
I don't see it as separate. I feel like writing and life are completely enmeshed. I feel like I don't see it as clearly as you seem to. I mean, my sister read an early draft of Cool Water, and she said, this is obviously all about Dad, but I can't really understand how. And I think it was a couple of drafts in that I could see that I'd sort of separated my father out into parts, into all the father figures. So, yeah, it's definitely my father period, and for me it's a novel about the power of the father. And patriarchy too.
You wrote a beautiful piece about your dad at the beginning of this year, I think.
About his death, yeah. Where, he was a very magical, big figure for me, and he was loving and loyal and also cunning and cruel and... And yeah, so I guess this novel is all about him, but in not any very direct way.
And there's fathers and sons and mothers and all sorts of things. And sorry, you were going to respond.
Oh no, I think it. Obviously, I think sometimes people also misconstrue like that relationship between real life and fiction. So a good example for me, when I did my first book, Shadow Boxing, it is autobiographical in a literal sense. There are versions of real life experience in all of those stories to a lesser or greater extent. But that's a long time ago. So when I'm thinking now, so you're asking me about Bhuta Khan and Ranji, there is nothing in Bhuta Khan's life that is literally part of Ranji. So yeah, Bhuta Khan did not run a scrapyard. He did not, do the things that Ranji did. There is no grandfather like Charlie in my life, but I said before, there's some reflection in how I see myself as a grandparent. I think what I do now is that if people said to me, what's the autobiographical element of this work, it's in your emotional experience, your intellect, your creativity that you bring to the work. So what I could say is, I do want to write a character who, like Bhuta Khan, was a gentle, loving man, and he was a Muslim, and he was part of my family. And when Joe first meets him and he sees this dark-skinned man with a turban on, he's a bit afraid. That was the fact that when my schoolmates, if I saw Bhuta and talked to him in the street, my Australian Italian schoolmates, they would think, oh, who's this spooky man, they would say. But they would get to know that he was a loving man. So I wanted to convey that love of that sort of character, but the real life experience of Ranji is a fictional experience. So in this book, the only autobiographical aspect, as in, when people say, did that really happen, is when Joe paints his face black, which is what I did, and the punishment that he receives, the same punishment I received. The stuff at the home, except for the love of books, I suppose, is fictional. These things did not happen in real life. They are not even remotely like my real life experience.
Yeah, I feel like what the most personal thing about a novel is what you're interested in, like what questions are held in that novel and what are you exploring. That seems to me really intimate.
Well, and the acute way in which writers look at the world and the observations that you pick up on. So anything we do, who knows where it will turn up.
The glass of water is in my next short story.
But I'm glad you mentioned the love of reading, though, because the bookshelf that is Charlie's bookshelf, in which he's opening up an entire world to Joe, is a lovely thing. And Charlie reads cowboy novels, and I think they read Tom Sawyer together as well. Are these important books to you, or were they?
Not the cowboy novels, although a lot of men I knew, I mean, I was a paper boy, talking about being a paper boy, and in those days when you had what was called a stand, so in other words, you didn't sell in the street, you had your own newsstand. We had a newsstand outside of Printworks in Gore Street. You would have your, the Herald of a Night, but you would have magazines and the paperback Western novels, which factory workers would buy. They're very thin. They would sell like crazy. So there was always a lot of them about. I mean, when you went to get your hair cut at the barber, there was only Western novels and sort of girly magazines, as they used to be called. And then when you're a kid, you're not sure which one to look at. Which one you get caught looking at. It was funny when you go to the barber, all the boys would be picking up something, and then they'd sort of, as soon as the door opened, they'd put it down. But anyway, what that reflected in part is just my love of reading, and my love of reading is a real salvation. And I think if I hadn't read voraciously as a kid, I wouldn't have gone back to and done year 12 when I was 29 at a TAFE college of a night. I wouldn't have been in the university. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. It's simple as that. It is the case that my nan, one of her boyfriends, and she over the years she had many of them, Jack, who was I don't know if anyone knows this term, if there are people old enough, but he was a star boarder at her house. And Jack used to pick up stuff from the street, and he would give me novels. And one of the things about Jack, he'd been in jail, and like my stepdad, who unfortunately now has dementia, my stepdad was a sort of career criminal in the 60s and 70s, and low grade stuff. That's why he spent so much time in jail. He wasn't very good at it. He's probably the most well-read man I've ever met. Like, he'd read the print off the page, to use the saying. So he like just big novels, 2 or 3 novels a week, and he started reading when he was in jail. And Jack was a bit like that. He's an incredibly well-read man. And when he gave me books when I was, say, between the age of, say, 8 and 12, they were books that were really difficult for me. They were like, the Penguin classics. They weren't picture books or Western magazines. He would say, this is an important book. And he gave me my first copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, for instance. So I started my own library because of that. And in my grandmother's house, he had the back bedroom, which I thought was always wrong. If you're going to be the star boarder, why should you have to creep so far? He had to get past all these other bedrooms where the non-star boarders were living. So he had one of those creaky bookcases in his house, and with an incredible variety of stuff as Charlie has. So it's sort of it's hard to find a topic, but it's mainly around my love of books, and the fact that I suppose if I've got something that annoys me with both Aboriginal people and working class people, when people say to me, "Oh, you're middle class now," materially I am. But when people ascribe your cultural values as middle class and say, like, you read and you go to art house films, I think, what do they think? Anyone remember the Mechanics Institutes that were all over Australia? Working class men and women going to, you go to a local library, you don't find middle class aging hipsters like me in there. You find migrants, you find retired people, you find people who don't buy books, and maybe because they can't afford them, maybe they're smarter than us in protecting the planet, they go to the library. And reading has always been a major part of growing up working class.
Here, Dapto Public Library for me. Now, if people have questions, then please put up your hand and we will bring a microphone to you. If you don't have questions, I could keep on going all afternoon, frankly. And while you're thinking of your question, and don't be shy, talking about reading, I will mention that Tony also, it's just been published, it's a beautiful book in the Writers on Writers series by Black Ink. And this one is Tony Birch on Kim Scott. And it is a beautiful reflection on Kim Scott's work. And my other plug, I know you're both going to be talking on the Big Weekend of Books on 15th to 16th of June.
We have already spoken on the Big Weekend of Books. We did a pre-record.
Yes, but it's going to be ready for everybody else.
And Kim and I mucked around so much, we said afterwards, I pity anyone who has to edit this conversation into a manageable 45 minutes.
Well, the person who recorded it said to me it was brilliant. So, that's what we do. Now, who's going to kick us off? Don't be shy. This is a great opportunity for you to. And here's a question down the front.
Obviously, violence against women is a bit sort of in the zeitgeist at the moment. You mentioned, Tony, unpredictability, mental illness and secrets. Obviously, that also happens with mothers. And sometimes single mothers can be even more traumatic. I wonder if that's going to follow through in any of the books.
Sorry, do you mean in the sense of women being perpetrators of violence? No. I suppose for 2 reasons. One is, I don't know, there's nothing I can draw on, and I'm not suggesting you can't do that fictionally. There's nothing that I can draw on that would help me get to the insight in that. So in other words, what I'm saying is, quite honestly, the idea of women harming their children is a reality, as you've just said. I can't even begin to think how I would find my way into that. And secondly, I suppose if there's I wouldn't say it's a political view, oh, it might be, but my view is that I don't disagree with you at all, but for mine, domestic violence is overwhelmingly a crime committed by men. So if there's something to be rectified or addressed, that's where I'd address my attention. Having said that, I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't write in that area. By all means, I'm sure people have. I have no sense of going there. Probably relative to the point, maybe not directly, it is interesting. My novel I'm working on now is a very contemporary novel, but it's dealing again with marginalised or homeless, mostly men. But in this book, I'm very interested in two key female characters in the book and how are they played out in the book, where I don't want them to be idealised women who, the angels of the half, to use the cliche. So I often find writing female characters, because I've grown up with so much protection from women, I find it hard to write bad women, I admit that. And I remember in my first novel, Blood, I have a bad mother called Gwen. She was a tabletop dancer. She always gets involved with really bad men. Her children are neglected. She doesn't assault them, but she neglects her children. I found that a real challenge to write that character. It was very rewarding to do so, but I did find it a real challenge. And my mum always reminds people when that book is brought up, I was never a tabletop dancer.
We see Evelyn very clearly in this novel, but the other women, and mothers, are sort of shadowier figures. Did you have to imagine their lives in great detail to have them there on the side, or were you always more interested in the fathers?
I feel like that was one of the interesting differences between mine and Tony's novels. Is I've written across gender and really focused on men and masculinity, and you're kind of writing in the opposite direction. And all the women in my novel were very whole and real to me, but I was focused on men and what it means to be a man and navigating those relationships between men.
Now, I can see that people are being a bit shy and they're saving up their questions for the signing table. So it's really interesting doing sessions like this for me, because I take a book that I've read sort of individually and then think about what it means to read them together. And so the obvious thing was, oh my goodness, we've got these two boys called Joe. But these are also both books that are infused with music. The title of your novel is from that song, and I could actually hear a very old Johnny Cash singing it in my head. And there's all sorts of music being listened to and danced to in your novel. So what is music? What does it mean to have music infused in your fiction?
I always have a soundtrack when I'm writing, and it just sort of comes together organically as the novel grows. The Cool Water title was really easy. I was researching the 1950s and just sort of immersing myself in everything 1950s Australia, and Frankie Lane's version of Cool Water was a hit in 1955, and then I walked into an op shop in Thornbury and there was an old vinyl of Frankie Lane. And it's about a man and his horse in a desert looking for water, and it all kind of came together. And then, my villain Victor whistles the song through the novel too.
Music.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Sometimes there's something you always want to do in a novel, and you don't know when you're going to do it. So, my grandmother's favourite song is "Wheel of Fortune" by K-Star. And we had it on the 78, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful song. And my grandmother could sing it really well, and then we could all sing it by heart. And you think, how can I sing this song by heart? Because you've just heard it over and over again. And it is, before I'd even written this novel, I actually thought I'd love to do something where K-Star and Wheel of Fortune has a cameo. And then when I thought in the novel about, I wanted to give Una and Marion some respite, So when Nuna comes to the house and she's bruised and then she starts to feel better, I thought, what could I do for Jo to see some love and tenderness? And it's around the record player and the records, so that it ends with bringing out the old 78 record of K-Star. But before that, this is set in 1965, and the 45 record had been out for quite some time. And I grew up in a house, despite my dad's behaviour, when I was 6-year-old, my mum was only 24. So she was she listened to Motown, British, female pop singers. She loved Cilla Black, for instance, Dusty Springfield, a lot of Motown stuff, a bit of the Beatles. My mum collected 45 records, and by the time we lived in the Housing Commission in the early 70s, we had about 445 records. And all the kids on the estate would come to our flat on a Sunday, and we would have the record player out, and kids would just pick a record, and it was a bit of that, and people would dance. So that moment was to show love through music. And I purposely chose songs that I like, Puff the Magic Dragon. I don't know why, but when I was a kid, every time I listened to that, and I had a good childhood voice, I have a shocking adult voice, I would sing Puff the Magic Dragon, and I'd just start howling. Like Johnny Ray, if anyone remembers Johnny Ray. Like I would be crying my eyes out. So I wanted to choose those songs. But that playing K-Star at the end was to play a song that it would fill our house with love. And my mum reads all my books, and she loves that scene and sees that as, if there's not a biographical moment in the book, it's that moment of that scene of the two sisters holding on to each other, singing, and then playing that song.
And it's, because music hotwires feeling too, doesn't it? Yeah. And in a way, when you're writing the novel, you wish that actually the song would play when the page turned and the reader could hear it.
Well, that is such a lovely way to bring the conversation together, that we're left with the sound of the music. So here at Words on the Waves, right by the sea at Umina, we've been with Tony Birch, author of Women and Children and many other books, and Myfanwy Jones, whose third novel is Cool Water. Both books are available here, and of course you can get them signed too. But first, a warm thank you to both of them.